Well, good morning, everybody. Well, bright and early. I tell you, it's a pretty hilarious thing to watch the reaction of our special guests, who, I've twisted their arm and said, it's a beautiful place, Banff. We've got this wonderful string quartet festival. We have this small lecture series that we do prior to some of the concerts, and would you come and then they walk into this hall and they see hundreds of people already seated. It's like those poor kids that went to do the master class the other day and saw 300 of you just sitting half an hour before. It doesn't get more intimidating than that. But thankfully, we have a man that it would take a lot more to intimidate, which is our dear friend David Goldbloom, Dr. David Goldbloom, who is, he has his feet in two worlds, the world of science and through his incredible career as a psychiatrist and a published author in that regard. And he also has his world as an extraordinary lover of arts in this country and has served on the boards of arts organizations. You can read all about his bio at Stratford, now at the Royal Conservatory. When putting together this group of talks for you this week, he was at the top of the list. So thank you, David, for making this trip. And I turn it over to him. Cheers.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm extraordinarily grateful for the opportunity to have this incomparable week with all of you in Banff. I've been to music festivals before, but I've never seen anything quite like what we've experienced here, not only in terms of the artistry, but also the incredible community. And I can tell you right off the top that it's been very good for my mental health. However, as an academic physician, I have to acknowledge that there's a lot of noise in the system that's driving my good mental health through this week. First of all, there's this incredible setting in the Rockies, the fact that we're at a center for arts and creativity. We're listening to incomparable music. We're meeting with interesting people at all meals who are passionate about music. And I'm also here with my wife and not at work. And those combine, and my wife was actually a flute student here in the early 1970s, so this is a bit of a reunion trip for me. Now, as a physician, I should always have my disclosures and disclaimers. Let me differentiate those for you. A disclosure relates to conflict of interest, and a disclaimer is why you shouldn't even be listening to this talk in the first place. I have no disclosures, no ties to the pharmaceutical industry. If I have any conflicts, they're deeply unconscious. And in terms of disclaimers, I should say that I am not a researcher in creativity per se, and I'm definitely not a string player. However, I do play the piano, and I think teachers and critics were unanimous in their view that I should apply to medical school. I'm mindful of being in the presence of Bill Littler, who is regularly recognized as the dean of Canadian music critics, and I'm honored to be in Bill's presence. If you've heard Bill's musical pitch, you might think he is the dizzy dean of music critics, but he is a wonderful person. Before I begin, let me ask you one question. How many of you in the course of your lives, your growing up, your families, your friends, your schoolmates, your work colleagues, your neighbors, your various communities, know somebody who has struggled with a mental illness? Hands up. So this is why, although I'm talking about that relatively rare gift of creativity, it occurs against the backdrop of a universal human experience. And I hope you'll keep that individual in mind as we progress through this talk. Now, I have to start somewhere, so let me start here with Glenn Gould, with perhaps the most famous piano recording of the 20th century. Now, I won't play the entire album for you, but this creative genius of the keyboard has been, in fact, the subject of endless neurological and psychiatric speculation. And it's a type of autopsy that risks sapping the pleasure out of listening to his music. It's a kind of deconstruction that takes away, in my view, from the ineffable quality of listening to Gould's performances. That recording was made in 1955. A few months beforehand, he completed his only major composition, his string quartet. And I checked with Barry just beforehand, and it's a quartet that has actually never been part of BISQ, and yet it is his major contribution to the compositional literature. Now, this rather sad-looking man is Robert Schumann. And Glenn Gould's biographer, Peter Ostwald, who was a psychiatrist as well as a violinist, wrote a marvelous biography of Gould, The Ecstasy and Tragedy of Genius. But before he wrote that, he wrote a book about Robert Schumann, The Inner Voices of a Musical Genius. And of course, then there's a Gould-Schumann intersect in his wonderful recording with members of the Juilliard of the Schumann Piano Quartet. Schumann and many, many members of his family suffered from mental illness, likely bipolar disorder. And not only Schumann, but other members of his family made suicide attempts. He ultimately died, as many of you will know, in an asylum. For many years, the belief was that, like virtually everybody else in Europe at the time, he had syphilis. But that, in fact, was not the cause of death, and an autopsy report that was rediscovered in the 1970s confirmed that. And indeed, dying of syphilis became one of the romantic affiliations of the 19th century between illness and creativity. And I remind you that whoever said that laughter is the best medicine never had gonorrhea. Now, let me begin by defining some terms. Firstly, the brain, which is in itself a kind of chemical soup, a highly elaborated and evolved neural network involving 100 billion neurons interacting with each other in multiple complex ways. And as one wag put it, if the brain was so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. It is the final frontier, if you will, in understanding the biology of the human. And more than any other organ, it is the organ that defines our uniqueness, defines our individuality. Woody Allen described it actually as his second favorite organ. Now, what about the mind? Well, the mind is that ineffable essence that defines our consciousness and our individuality, but it defies anatomic localization. Even with our fanciest brain imaging, we can't point to something and say, there's the mind. Nevertheless, that doesn't stop researchers from trying to understand what lights up during the creative process, and I'll come back to that. And the other definitional challenge, of course, is creativity itself. Like pornography, we all think we know it when we see it. And that can be true whether we're looking at our children's drawings or listening to inspiring music all week or watching great stage performances. There are many operational definitions of what it is to be creative. The capacity to see something new that others cannot. And I've had this experience actually with an architect when we were building a new hospital in Toronto, and I got to work with the architect Bruce Kuwabara, whose firm will be redesigning the interior of the Eric Harvey Theatre. And we had an empty field where the new hospital was going to be, and Bruce, as an architect, very cool, dressed in black, head to toe, would stand and look at the field like this. And I would stand next to him and look at the field like this. And I realized I couldn't see what he was seeing. And that seemed to me a pretty good definition of creativity. And other definitions include a mental journey between ideas or concepts that involves either a novel route or a novel destination. Also, I think a highly evocative definition. We saw images in last night's film of Thomas Edison, who famously described creativity as 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. But we do need to have operational terms if we're going to do research on creativity, because we need to be able to measure it. So the common agreement is that it involves bringing something into being that is original, that is new, unusual, novel, or unexpected, but also in some way valued or valuable. It has to be useful, good, adaptive, appropriate, and it requires a kind of divergent thinking. It requires people to go off a beaten path with originality, with cognitive flexibility, and then to be able to elaborate, to spell it out, to spin it out. And these are some of the same characteristics that we see in some people who experience mental illness. The achievement, the creative achievement, is the ultimate validation of the creative process. So we're in fact defining creativity post hoc. It's once we've got the product that we say that was a creative journey. So what do you need to be creative? Well, intelligence broadly defined, but I would hasten to add that many intelligent people are not especially creative. Imagination, drive, solitude, and for many people, incentive. That incentive could be financial, as it was at times for Hemingway, for Beethoven. You know, and there's one of the least successful Stephen Sondheim musicals is called Merrily We Roll Along, about the relationship between a composer and a lyricist who write musicals. And at one point they're being interviewed jointly by a reporter who asks the classic question of composers and lyricists, which comes first, the words or the music? And the pair answers in unison, the contract. So let me, as the former chair of the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, share with you the words of one of the most prolific, successful, and memorable playwrights of all time. I'm speaking, of course, of Neil Simon. Now, Neil Simon had the great misfortune to be stuck on an airplane seated next to Nancy Andreasen, one of the world's leading researchers on creativity. She's a psychiatrist who has a PhD in English, but is now a brain imaging researcher. And because Simon was stuck next to her for the flight, she interviewed him about his creative process. And what he told her was really quite revealing about how he works. He said, I slip into a state that is apart from reality. In other words, that capacity to focus intensely, to get to a remote and transcendent place where he could write. He said, I don't write consciously. It's as if the muse is sitting on my shoulder, which suggests that his creative process couldn't be consciously planned or willed into existence. And indeed, he said that he never knew how his plays would end when he started writing them. And he wrote 32 of them. He said, my mind wanders, even when I talk. In other words, that there was an altered filtering mechanism that led to heightened perceptions of things that other people weren't necessarily noticing, a greater sensitivity to stimuli, and an increased intensity of experience. And then finally, he said, I've always felt as if I'm invisible. And that is, for a person who writes plays about human interaction, that observer status that allows him to step back and see what is going on. And in fact, some of the aspects that Neil Simon described have been validated in a 2019 study of creativity and mental health that I will discuss a little bit later. Now, to shift gears a little, let's take a look at a composer who Glenn Gould felt did not die too young, but rather lived too long, and whose music Gould both recorded and dismissed. Now, this picture of Mozart looks an awful lot like those guys playing the Haydn Quartet in the Kronos film last night. I think he could have been an extra. But let me read to you from a letter that was apparently written by Mozart, later published in 1815 by the musicologist Friedrich Rochlitz, who was a friend of Beethoven and Schubert. And this is what Mozart wrote. When I am, as it were, completely in myself, entirely alone and of good cheer, say, traveling in a carriage, or walking after a good meal, or during the night when I cannot sleep, it is on such occasions that my ideas flow best and most abundantly. Whence and how they come, I know not, nor can I force them. All this fires my soul, and provided I'm not disturbed, my subject enlarges itself, becomes methodized and defined, and in the whole, though it be long, it stands almost complete and finished in my mind, so that I can survey it, like a fine picture or a beautiful statue at a glance. Nor do I hear in my imagination the parts successively, but I hear them, as it were, all at once. What a delight this is, I cannot tell. All this inventing, this producing, takes place in a pleasing, lively dream. What thus has been produced, I do not easily forget, and this is perhaps the best gift I have to thank my divine Maker for. When I proceed to write down my ideas, I take out of the bag of my memory, if I may use that phrase, what has been previously collected into it in the ways I have mentioned. For this reason, the committing to paper is quickly done, for everything is, as I've said before, already finished, and it rarely differs on paper from what it was in my imagination. You can imagine why Salieri hated this guy. I mean, he had to have been a bit of a pest. And it may be of some comfort for you to know that this letter is now considered a fraudulent forgery by Friedrich Rochlitz. And so his creative process remains a mystery. Let me get to the less poetic. This man will be recognizable, I hope, to many people. This is the late Richard Rodgers, who was, I would say, a little more plain-spoken than Mozart around his creative process. He summed it up in 4 words. He said, I can pee melody. Now, as you know, he had a fairly strong and enduring stream. With really only 2 collaborators, Lawrence Hart and Oscar Hammerstein II, and one very unhappy collaboration with Stephen Sondheim. But let me get back to Shakespeare. And this portrait, which may not be familiar to all of you, is actually in Canadian hands now and is considered the only portrait of Shakespeare done in his lifetime. So this is as close as we get to knowing what Shakespeare looked like. Why does Shakespeare matter? Well, he had a profound influence on how we perceive the inner life of people, using theater not to tell the what when and where as much as the how and why of human stories. And extraordinarily, his plays endure throughout the world in every language. In his time, mental illness was considered an imbalance of the four humors of the body or of demonic possession. But in fact, the first book in English on mental illness, a treatise on melancholy, was published in 1586, 3 years before he wrote his first play. We have no idea if Shakespeare read it. His entire life and what he did, what he read, is a subject of endless speculation. But by the 19th century, in asylums in America, American psychiatrists believed that everything you needed to know about human psychopathology was contained in the works of William Shakespeare. The word suicide was actually coined after Shakespeare died, but there are nevertheless more than a dozen suicides throughout his plays, and you can probably think of some of the famous ones like in Romeo and Juliet, but they're throughout the Shakespearean canon. Just out of curiosity, is anybody in this audience named Jessica? Do we have any Jessicas in the house? One. So you owe your name to Shakespeare, who invented the name for Shylock's daughter in The Merchant of Venice. It's one of the thousands of words that he introduced into the English language, and that's entirely irrelevant to today's talk. So what is the first big question I want to address? Are creative artists moody? Well, Lord, and it sounds by the chuckles you've already answered it. Lord Byron said, "We of the craft are all crazy. Some are touched by gaiety, some by melancholy, but we are all touched." And of course, Lord Byron himself went on to touch a number of people. But we all know a long list of affected composers by mental illness: Berlioz, Bruckner, Elgar, Handel, Ives, Mahler, Mussorgsky, Rachmaninoff, who have famously dedicated his second piano concerto to his therapist, Dr. Dahl, who brought him out of a deep depression prior to composing the piano concerto. Rossini, Schumann, as I mentioned, Scriabin, Wolff, and many others. But this linkage between creativity and madness in its generic sense has been posited since the time of Aristotle. Aristotle said that those who have become eminent in philosophy, politics, poetry, and the arts have all had tendencies toward melancholia. And of course, Shakespeare said, "The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact." But from Aristotle to the spring of 2019, this debate continues to rage in literature. And just about a month ago, a researcher wrote, "The research literature is far from an agreement on the relationship between creativity and vulnerability to mental disorders." So if you were hoping to leave this morning with an absolute sense of the linkage, you may want to leave now, or just leave at the end of the talk with a sense of bitter disappointment. Recent research, however, does support higher rates of mood disorders among artists and among their families than healthy controls. In addition, the relatives of creative writers show higher rates of creativity than the relatives of healthy controls, very broadly in music, arts, dance, and mathematics. And I will come back to relatives in a moment, even though some of us dread coming back to our relatives. I will revisit the subject. The problem, and it is a big problem, is the romantic nature of the affiliation, that we idealize and romanticize the linkage in terms of the mad genius in a garret apartment writing poetry or composing operas or composing string quartets, that somehow the experience of suffering infuses and enhances the creative process. And that is a prominently 19th century notion, and it's one that's really not supported by evidence. There have been a couple of studies looking at the use of lithium, that salt from the organic elements table you may remember from high school, that has been a revolution in the treatment of bipolar illness, manic depressive illness, now for 70 plus years. And when they looked at writers and artists who had been treated with lithium and asked the impact on their creativity, only a quarter of them felt that lithium had actually somehow diminished their creativity. 3/4 said that when their mood disorder was stabilized with lithium, their creative output grew dramatically. And this is an important time to remember the immobilizing effects of illnesses like depression. Jonathan Swift spent a year without reading or speaking to anyone. Samuel Johnson wrote that a kind of strange oblivion has settled over me. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, stuporous for a long period of time. Rossini, believing he was penniless and unable to compose. Keats, writing, "I am so depressed, I have not an idea to put to paper." Now, I can cite you countless individual examples, but we need to make a transition from the ideographic to the nomothetic. Now, that's a turn of phrase that if you use it at a cocktail party, people say, "Excuse me, I just need to freshen my drink," and you never see them again. And so I had to look it up too. So the ideographic approach looks at the unique experience of a single individual. The nomothetic approach uses the power of numbers and research analysis to look at large groups of people to see what conclusions can be drawn. And that's really the 20th and 21st century approach to science. And this really began in 1987 in Iowa, where Nancy Andreasen, the psychiatrist I mentioned, did her study of writers at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, a famous gathering for creative writers. And she was really the first researcher in this area to use a control group, that essential element of 20th century research, that you need to be able to say, compared to what? And so she had a control group of healthy individuals who she compared to her group of writers. The writers, let me add, I'm not here to slag writers in any way. At the time of the research, none of the writers had a psychiatric illness. They were all healthy by the measures used. And similarly, the controls were healthy by the measures used. But when she looked at lifetime history, she found that 80% of the writers had experienced a mood disorder at some point in their lives, 30% had struggled with alcohol, and 7% had struggled with drugs. And in the control group, the numbers were markedly lower. They weren't zero by any means, but they were markedly lower. And Nancy Andreasen wrote, all of the writers were of normal mood at the time I interviewed them, so they could look back on their periods of depression or mania with considerable detachment. And consistently, they indicated that they were unable to be creative when depressed or manic. And so if you remember one thing from this talk, it would be indeed that this has a dampening rather than a stimulating effect on creativity based on all the research that we have. But if we look beyond those individuals to their families, Nancy Andreasen looked at 116 relatives of the 30 writers and 121 relatives of the control group. And what she found was that the relatives of the writers were far more likely to be in a creative profession or have creative achievement than the relatives of the control groups, but they were also more vulnerable to having mood disorders. The following year, Ruth Richardson at Saybrook University in Pasadena generated a very important scientific curve that I want to show you now. I hope it isn't too complex a figure. This is called the inverted U hypothesis of the relationship between creativity and psychopathology. And that is that there are certain elements of psychopathology, the umbrella term we use to describe psychological distress and psychiatric symptoms, which as they start to emerge may lead to growth in creativity. But if they become a runaway train, as is often the case in mental illness, creativity then plummets. I said I would go back to Glenn Gould, and let me do so. In the context of what has become one of the most widespread diagnoses in popular culture today, autism spectrum disorder. Peter Ostwald, in his biography, wrote about 3 sentences about Gould in the context of autism spectrum disorder. He said, Glenn obviously did not suffer from autism. Had he been autistic, the remarkable success he had in a public career would have been impossible. But some of the behavior he manifested in childhood and during his adolescence, a marked fear of certain physical objects, disturbances in empathy, social withdrawal, self-isolation, and obsessive attention to ritualized behavior, does resemble a condition called Asperger disease, which is a variant of autism. And this view has been reinforced by Tim Page, the culture critic of the Washington Post, who also has what we used to call Asperger's disorder and what we now call autism spectrum disorder. Ostwald noted that Asperger's is occasionally associated with an unusual degree of giftedness in some particular fields of expression, such as music, mathematics, drama, athletics, or art, and he implicated Bela Bartok and Ludwig Wittgenstein in this category. Timothy Maloney, the former director of the music library at the National Library of Canada and a musician who also played on Gould's one chamber music recording that he conducted of Wagner, which is an extraordinary recording, wrote a 78-page paper on why Gould had autism spectrum disorder, a view that has been reinforced by a number of people who knew him. The second big question for you is, what does the study of families really tell us? And here we turn to Sweden. And you will remember, those of you who are Canadian in the audience, we had a long debate about the long-form census in Canada and whether we should have the long-form census or the short-form census. Well, let me tell you, in Sweden, what we call the long-form census is just saying hello, because the amount of information that the Swedish government garners on all of its citizens is jaw-dropping, but it allows for population-based studies that we could never dream of doing in Canada. So it was a major study in Sweden in 2011 that relates to creativity and mental disorder. And through their database, they identified over 50,000 people with schizophrenia, 30,000 people with bipolar disorder, 217,000 people with depression. And then they studied all their first, second, and third degree relatives. And then they got an equal number of healthy controls and studied all their first, second, and third degree relatives. And they used as a proxy for creativity, what sort of work do you do? Because they have that information. So they talked about creative professions, be they artistic or scientific. They had their IQ scores. They knew everything about them. And what they found was that having a diagnosis of schizophrenia led to no difference in having a creative profession, although you might be more inclined to a visual artistic profession. But that parents and siblings of people with schizophrenia were significantly more likely to have creative professions than the relatives of healthy controls. And that was truly an intriguing finding. What is it about having a genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia that might predispose you to being more creative? When it came to bipolar disorder, it was significantly overrepresented in the creative professions compared to controls, mainly in the arts. And those first-degree relatives of people with bipolar disorder were more likely to hold creative professions. Depression alone made no difference, probably because depression is so common. 1 in 5 women, 1 in 5 men over the course of their lives will struggle with a depression, whereas only 1 in 100 people will have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. So they tried to explain how this finding made sense. And they came up with what they called the balancing selection hypothesis. I'm sure we're all familiar here with, no, okay. Let me explain the balancing selection hypothesis. It is that there is a genetic susceptibility to mental disorders, both in people who have their disorders and their relatives, that links to adaptive advantages in relation to creativity. And this fits in with that inverted U. You may have a diluted dose, if you will, of those components that lead to mental illness, such that you don't necessarily experience the full flower of mental illness, but you may experience aspects of it that are conducive to being creative. I'm going to skip over some of the other elaborations of this familial research, but expanding it to include other diagnoses didn't change the findings 2 years later, when they expanded it to include anorexia nervosa, autism spectrum disorder, and other conditions. It was really something quite specific to bipolar disorder and schizophrenia that was the striking finding. This year, Scandinavian researchers said, you know what, creative profession is a broad category. There are many people in creative professions who are not necessarily all that creative. Let's talk about what they call big C creative. That's not your child's doodling. That is something really big and creative that's recognized by an international panel of artists and experts. And so they did that identifying 35 visual artists who were regarded as highly creative, big C creative, 40 scientists, big C creative, and a comparison group of healthy controls who were not especially creative, but were really smart. So they removed any confounding factor of variability of intelligence. And they found no difference in terms of lifetime or current diagnoses of mental illness. But in the visual artists, they found elements of things that we see in people who have schizophrenia. Things like odd speech, odd belief, ideas of reference, feeling that things that do not pertain to them actually do pertain to them, and unusual perceptions, which in full flower in psychosis can be things like hallucinations. They also found certain autistic elements to visual artists more than the controls in terms of mannerisms, social awareness, social communication, social motivation, that they were much more inclined to isolate themselves and to be alone. And they concluded that people benefit from certain traits only up to an extent. If uniqueness is divergent enough to cause dysfunction, this dysfunction probably affects creativity as well. Full expressions of mental illness most likely interfere with creative achievement. And so I apologize if I sound like a broken record on that particular theme, but it is, I hope, one of the big takeaways. What they found among the visual artists that was so striking in their creativity was nonconformism, open-mindedness to unusual ideas and perceptual experiences, and a cognitive style that challenges traditional thinking and explores novel states of mind with less cognitive constraint. They don't have the brakes on them the way we do. And to me, that sounds like the essence of creativity, that observation from 2019. Now, many of you are old enough, as I am, to have seen the film The Graduate when it came out. So you remember the one word of advice that Dustin Hoffman got? Plastics, all right? Plasticity is the buzzword of neuroscience right now because it provides us with hope. It provides us with hope that our brains, rather than starting to dwindle in our 20s and go into a slow decline, are actually capable of expansion, growth, rewiring, new connections. And that should be encouraging to all of you who've been immersed in chamber music for this entire week, that you're doing good things for your brains. And indeed, there's a famous study of British cab drivers in London looking at the area of the brain called the hippocampus, where memory is stored. And the longer you were driving a cab in London, a black cab, the bigger your hippocampus got compared to a control population. Now, I suspect that with Waze and Google Maps, our hippocampi are going to shrink dramatically. And similar research has been done on musicians with areas of the brain in symphonic musicians that appear to expand with years of playing. We're also at the level of identifying candidate genes for creativity, because we know that there is a familial component of creativity. How much of that is environment versus nature is a challenge. And for those of you wondering about that nature-nurture issue, the good news is we no longer have to choose. We no longer have to choose because of the emerging field of epigenetics, which shows us how environmental factors turn on and turn off genes that put us at risk for various conditions. I always say that every parent who has one child believes profoundly in nurture. They believe everything they are doing as a parent molds and shapes that child. And then they have a second child, and they discover nature. Now, the brain is not a unitary organ. It has multiple working parts. And one particular area of the brain, right over here, has been identified as essential for creativity, and it's called the right prefrontal cortex. And the right prefrontal cortex is one of the last areas of the brain to develop. Most of you who've had teenagers will know that it's really not there until they hit their 20s. And this area of the brain uses the full arsenal of higher cognitive functions to address novel thoughts. And it is the place where we implement the expression of insight. And creativity in brain imaging machinery recruits the right prefrontal cortex in terms of lighting up when we have people do creative tasks in a scanner. Now, there are other areas of the brain, like the side of the brain, the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital lobes of the brain, where knowledge is sort of stored and recruited. But that's different than the integrative capacity of the right prefrontal cortex. In other words, we could imagine an individual who is possessed with an endowed temporal, occipital, and parietal cortex, but a much less remarkable dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That person would have an encyclopedic knowledge of a discipline, but would make only minor contributions to the advancement of that discipline. The fourth big question is, why might creativity have something in common with psychiatric symptoms? And this leads us to the work of Shelley Carson at Harvard, who described the shared vulnerability model. And she said factors common to both creativity and psychopathology act to increase access and attention to material that is processed below the level of conscious awareness, while protective cognitive factors allow for monitoring to make sure it doesn't get out of control or become overwhelming. And she gave a beautiful example of this from Arthur Koestler. Arthur Koestler's model of creativity was a skin diver exploring the underwater world while still connected to the surface via a breathing tube. So that was the capacity to regress, more or less at will, to the games of the underground without losing contact with the surface. Now, there are three elements to shared vulnerability, and I apologize if this gets a little technical, but I hope I can translate it for you in a way that's accessible. The first element of shared vulnerability is something called reduced latent inhibition. Latent inhibition is the capacity we all have in this room to screen out of our awareness stimuli that we determine to be irrelevant. Indeed, some of you may be screening me out right now as you're thinking about the glorious music you're going to hear in 45 minutes. All right? But we need that filtering mechanism. We exclude, in fact, most of the stimuli we encounter at any given moment. And for people who are creative, that inhibition, that screening out, may actually be reduced to their advantage. It may enhance the access to and the use of elements for conscious, novel, and original recombinations. And that is also something that is seen in people with mental illness, where the inability to screen out stimuli as irrelevant can actually be frightening. The person who walks down a street thinking that everyone is staring at them, monitoring them, following them, that's a terrifying experience to have. And yet it can be there, and it's actually been linked to dopamine activity in a particular region of the brain. The second area of shared vulnerability is called enhanced novelty seeking. That intrinsic motivation that some people have to attend to new ideas. And creative people tend to seek out novel or complex stimuli over simple and familiar ones. Again, it's actually internally rewarded by the chemical dopamine, and it enhances curiosity and motivation. We also see that enhanced novelty seeking in people when they're manic and when they're abusing substances. And the final component of shared vulnerability, that bridge between creativity and mental illness, is something called neural hyperconnectivity, abnormal linking of neurons in different brain regions that are not typically functionally connected one to another. This is reported widely in schizophrenia, mania, depression, drug intoxication, the experience of synesthesia, like the ability to smell a musical note, and in the brains of highly creative people who are engaged in complex creative tasks. So if that's the case, if there is this shared vulnerability, what protects people? What keeps them from tumbling into mental illness? Well, we know that there are a number of protective factors: intelligence, enhanced working memory that allows you to hold multiple constructs in your head simultaneously rather than be overwhelmed by one of them, and something called cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch attentional states from one stimulus or concept to another through a conscious mental control. And that's associated with being open to new experiences. I'm not going to talk to you much about the string quartet literature. I've been amazed at recent studies that have been done, however, looking at string quartets performing under laboratory circumstances, looking at nonverbal communication and how that occurs in various settings. I did see a paper from this year of a study of two quartets who had each won several important international prizes. I'm not saying which prizes because the article doesn't say. And they filmed them in the same repertoire, both in rehearsal and in concert. And they were filmed without knowing the purpose of the filming. They were playing Bartók and Haydn. Okay, hands up. Who wants more Bartók this week? No. And, okay. Young man in the back row from Kronos wants more Bartók. And they looked at measures of anxiety. And get ready for this. So we're going to hold the front page for this story. They found that measures of anxiety were significantly higher among performers in concert than in rehearsal. Now, this to me is the classic example of using sophisticated research methodology and statistical analysis to confirm what your grandmother knew. It reminds me that, obviously the stress of performance creates a different kind of juice than the stress of rehearsal. And there's a famous story about Laurence Olivier when he was playing Othello at the National Theatre with a very young Maggie Smith as Desdemona, really still a teenager. And he, after a performance that was particularly wonderful, he went to his dressing room, and the rest of the cast heard furniture being tossed and glass being shattered, and they went in, and he was beside himself. And they said, "Sir Laurence, you just gave a great performance. Why are you so upset?" And he said, I know it was a great performance. I don't know what I did." And that was his dilemma. I'm hoping that I have dissuaded you from romantic notions of the affiliation of frank illness with creativity. This is not to say that people have not been creative in the context of adversity. And we have many examples of this. Don Quixote, the first modern novel written when Cervantes was in jail. Beethoven writing in the wake of his disillusionment with Napoleon. Picasso painting Guernica in the wake of devastation. But these are not to be confused with mental illnesses that can strike anyone, any of us, in the absence of external threat and have a paralytic effect on the individual. And remember that illnesses like depression disrupt our fundamental human processes like cognition, our ability to attend, our ability to concentrate, our ability to remember, our ability to feel motivation, and our ability to make decisions. All of these are essential for our work, be it creative or non-creative, and all of them are disrupted by depression. And it has that relentless capacity to deprive us of pleasure and of hope, all of which are integral to the human experience and for creation. So let me close by quoting the fourth woman who has been a major contributor in the last 40 years to our thinking about creativity and the mind, and that is Kay Redfield Jamison, distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins, author of books about creativity, as well as books about her own struggle with bipolar disorder, a disorder in which she has been one of the world authorities. I had the privilege of being on a panel with her at the Art Gallery of Ontario a few years ago, and she, in her summary remarks, stated things very plainly. She said, most people who are creative do not have mental illness, and most people who are mentally ill are not unusually creative. So let us not trivialize the impact of mental illness on the person, the family, the society, and our culture, and remember that we are in the end much better at battling mental illness than at bottling creativity. And hopefully, when we treat mental illness, it helps let creativity out of the bottle. Thank you for your attention.